That's a full-service presidential candidate. Yeah.
Hell yeah.
Yeah, look at this. We don't really office in style. No office opening is complete.
Who's next? Get right here. Thank you, Andrew. That was great.
Oh, look, here's my cat. Hello, Zer0 Books readers. It's me again, Douglas Lane. This is my cat, Serenity. In this video, I'll be answering the question, why did Yang's gang get down on their knees? I'll seek out the answer by considering Adorno and Horkheimer's notion of instrumental reason, while critiquing a few lines from a book by C.L.R. James, Cornelius Castoriadis, and Grace Lee. But, to cut to the chase, the reason these supporters got down on their knees is because they embraced being over becoming, and mistook the thinker for thinking. If that seems opaque to you, no worries. At the end of this free association of a video, I'll read a quote from the therapist Eliot Rosenstock from his book Zizek in the Clinic, and that will bring it all into the light. Now, Andrew Yang's presidential campaign is unique for how it emphasizes the cerebral and the rational over the rhetorical and the political. Yang's campaign hats read math for two reasons. The first is that Yang claims that if one does the math, one will find that automation and not immigration is the primary threat facing the American working class. And the second reason for the math slogan is that it is a play on Trump. Where Trump has his MAGA hats, Yang has his math hats. And math stands for Make America Think Harder.
The robots are coming. The robots are coming.
Yang's emphasis on technology, statistical analysis, and on the unintended consequences of industrial development has led him to a campaign style that embraces the nerdy and the smart. And yet, despite the way Yang purports to eschew power, a few of his most dedicated supporters still ended up on their knees in a moment that unintentionally pantomimed a pornographic money shot. What Andrew Yang and his gang proved was that, as Adorno and Horkheimer argued, rationality really can turn into its opposite. Instrumental or practical reason especially tends to substitute self-gratification for rigorous open thinking. Horkheimer, in his book The Eclipse of Reason, explained that rationalist ideologies today hinge on a mostly unexamined self-interest. He wrote that when the ordinary man is asked what is meant by the term reason, he will say that reasonable things are things that are obviously useful. And Horkheimer said, this type of reason should be called subjective reason, because it abandons the idea that an aim can be reasonable for its own sake, without reference to some kind of subjective gain or advantage. In order to maintain this sort of subjective reason, one has to bracket out questions about objective morality and absolute good. When pressed, today's advocates of subjective reason will say that the objective moral basis behind what they'll admit are subjective moral claims is not fully understood yet.
Yeah. Well, here I really disagree. I think that there is a sort of an absolute basis. If you press me too hard, I'll be in trouble because I can't sketch it out. But some sort of an absolute basis ultimately residing in fundamental human qualities in terms of which a real notion of justice is grounded.
But to claim that the Yang gang's reason is subjective doesn't go far enough. This can easily turn into a claim that the Yang gang is somehow problematic, that their impulse to think harder is itself suspect from the start. To stop with this observation about the instrumentality of Yang's reasoning, to notice how UBI, for instance, is a solution for the crisis caused by capitalist development that stays well within the bounds of the logic of capitalism, can easily risk positivism itself. When evaluating how rationality can go wrong, how it is that fetishizing math can become kinky, we should turn our critical gaze around on ourselves. For instance, we should take a look at critical theory itself to see if we can find instances of positivity and instrumentality in our own thinking. After all, we ourselves are hardly immune from the authoritarian impulse. Let's take another example of the critique of reason or rationality, this time in a book written by a Marxist sect that called itself the Correspondence Publishing Committee back in 1958. Let's take a look to see if we can discover how reason becomes myth, or how thinking really hard can move you to your knees. When C.L.R. James, Grace Lee, and Cornelius Castoriadis wrote Facing Reality, the reality that they had to face was, quote, the monstrous reality of state power that ruled over and above society. For the CPC, the greatest threat to the self-liberation of the working class was to be found in both the form of a one-party state, such as the Soviet Union, and in the form of a welfare state, like the USA. Before neoliberalism, these radicals believed that state power was threatening to crush the hope for freedom forever. It was the state that was going to smash both bourgeois libertarianism and socialism. For the CPC, the welfare state was nothing but a halfway house to the ultimate totalitarian domination, as had been imagined in Orwell's 1984. The reason behind the rise of the state, the reason for both Stalinist state capitalism and the entrenchment of the welfare state in the West was, well, reason. Since Descartes' time, the power of reason had turned against itself. Reason had turned into its opposite. Descartes' rationalism had seen each human being as an individual, but this philosophy had transformed into a justification for tyranny, as it was presumed that the natural leader was merely the most able, the most energetic, the most far-seeing individual. In the end, according to the CPC, Hitler and Stalin became the sole individuals in their countries entitled to any personality, any individuality at all. But what the CPC left out, what C.L.R. James surely knew but didn't mention, was that the rationality that had developed a scientific method that could master nature had been driven by a social relationship between people that appeared as a social relationship between things. We had turned ourselves into servants for an abstraction measured in hours worked. The difficulty was not that our reason was too subjective, but rather that, despite what great leaders might insist, we had all, leader and follower alike, given over our subjectivity to a world that we believed was independent from us.
When we watch the viral video of Andrew Yang's followers or supporters getting down on their knees to receive his communion, we should consider another reason for why they submit to his authority. And that is that subjective intelligence tends to turn into its opposite. It turns into a belief in a myth. And sometimes that myth can take the form of an authoritarian, omniscient leader who gives the followers an excuse for their own kind of knowledge, for believing what they believe in the way that they believe it. And it gives them a way out of taking responsibility for their own desire to believe something in a particular way.
According to Zizek, all political leadership operates through the creation of a mythical figure who is supposed to know what his followers want more than they do. While we find ourselves caught up in a system, a social world, not of our own making, the leader is there to know our situation for us. According to Zizek, the entire point of a political leader is that he or she is supposed to know the mystery that is always at the core of every ideology. In the case of Yang, with his emphasis on knowing or rationality, this is nearly made explicit, which is not in and of itself a bad thing. In fact, the difficulty with Yang is that his power and position isn't quite explicit enough. In Eliot Rosenstock's book, Zizek in the Clinic, the anti-advice therapist explains that, like a politician, therapists are the ones who are supposed to know. However, unlike a politician, the therapist is supposed to know that he's the one supposed to know. Rosenstock writes, quote, "The therapist takes on a sort of transcendental quality, which is not entirely unfounded, given the therapist's supposed ability to provide movement conducive to the client's well-being without knowing anything about the client. The therapist possesses the savior in the beginning, but the therapeutic process should then aim toward the client surpassing this religious dimension of therapy. The trouble with Yang is that while he might be good at math, he doesn't understand who he is trying to be for his followers. Along with the limitations inherent in UBI, or the way that Yang's vision remains fully within the economic system as it is, the other difficulty is that Yang himself is being swept along in the fantasy of his campaign. Andrew Yang knows the math, but he doesn't know what he wants or what he's doing. The difficulty for the left, or would-be leftist leaders, is to figure out how to avoid the same trap. How can we become saviors while leading people past us to self-understanding? How can we develop a politics that leads us to stepping out of the usual kinky power game? Thanks for watching this Zer0 Books video. If you enjoyed it, subscribe to this channel and click on the notifications bell so that you'll be alerted whenever we release a new video. You should also consider supporting us on Patreon. Our patrons get access to our Inside Zer0 Books podcast every week and can get access to the Zer0 Books book club and help us to continue making online content from the left.